At her own sister's wedding, Big Shaq's wife was seated at the edge, not by accident, but by design. The racist groom thought distance would send a message. What he didn't expect was Big Shaq walking in, uninvited to their silence, and ready to turn the whole celebration into a reckoning. When dignity meets prejudice, the collapse isn't loud, until it is. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The envelope came in ivory white, thick, glossy, almost smug in its silence. The Whitmore family crest was embossed in gold foil, gleaming in the morning sun that filtered through the kitchen window. Shawnee turned it over in her hands like something fragile, something that had weight beyond paper. Her fingers lingered on the edges before she finally opened it. Inside, Clarissa's smile beamed from a photo card, all teeth, all polish, standing beside Brad Whitmore in front of a massive stone estate draped in Virginia ivy. Their names were scripted in elegant calligraphy. Clarissa Renee Jackson and Brad Thomas Whitmore invite you to witness the beginning of forever. Shawnee stared at the words but didn't read them. Not really. Shaquille sat at the kitchen table, half listening to the jazz station playing low in the background as he stirred honey into his tea. His bulk filled the room, but his presence never pressed. It rested gentle and comforting. When he looked up, he saw the tightness in Shawnee's jaw before she said a word. "Clarissa's getting married," she said without meeting his eyes. Shaq smiled, warm as always. "About time, huh?" Shawnee finally looked up. "It's not that." He set down the spoon, quieting the soft clink of metal against porcelain. "What is it?" Shawnee hesitated, then slid the invitation across the table. Shaq scanned it, one brow raising ever so slightly. "Whitmore?" he asked. "Isn't that the family from—" "Yeah," she cut in. "Old money, Southern money." Shaq nodded slowly. He didn't need more. Brad's family name came with a reputation. The kind built behind gated estates and private clubs. The kind that welcomed wealth, but flinched at certain kinds of history. Shawnee didn't need to spell it out. "I thought she was different," she muttered. "Clarissa, but this doesn't feel like her. She hasn't called in weeks. All the wedding stuff, I hear about it from Mom, not her." Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "She your sister. Blood doesn't break that easy." Shawnee looked away. "Sometimes it fades." He reached across and gently covered her hand with his skin dark and wide, wrapped around hers like protection. "Then we go," he said softly. "We show up with love. That's our job." She stared at him, then gave a small nod, letting herself lean into his steadiness. But even as she smiled, the first seed of something sharp rooted in her chest. A week later, they were in Savannah. Spanish moss hung from ancient trees, and the Whitmore estate stood like a monument to old-world pride. Columns lined the mansion's front, and the driveway curled like a question mark toward the doors. Shawnee stepped out of the car and instantly felt the eyes. The estate staff, clad in muted uniforms, gave quick nods but didn't smile. A woman in pearls stood near the front steps. Brad's mother, Shawnee assumed. She didn't come down to greet them, just watched from above like royalty. Clarissa finally appeared, radiant in a pale blue dress, arms outstretched. But even as she hugged Shawnee, it felt rehearsed. Shawnee could feel the stiffness in her spine, the way her eyes darted toward the windows behind her. Shaq, ever gracious, swept Clarissa into a bear hug that made her laugh despite herself. "You sure you ready for this, lil' sis?" He grinned. Clarissa nodded, but there was hesitation in the corners of her smile. Inside, the decor screamed heritage. Oil portraits lined the halls, stern men in waistcoats, women with corsets and scowls. Shawnee couldn't help but notice the absence of color in more ways than one. At the rehearsal dinner, the microaggressions began like whispers. "So what is it you do again, Shawnee?" one of Brad's aunts asked, swirling wine. "I run a nonprofit for inner-city youth," she replied. The woman blinked. "How noble." Another guest leaned in toward Shaq. "Must be fun living off endorsements. Easy money, huh?" Shaq smiled politely. "The real fun's in the mentoring work. Kids need guidance more than I ever needed sneakers." The table laughed nervously. No one followed up. Later, as they walked the garden path back to the guest house, Shawnee gripped Shaq's arm. "They act like I'm furniture," she whispered. "Like I'm here for show." Shaq didn't answer right away. He just looked up at the moon, wide and watchful. "They don't know you," he finally said. "That's their loss." Shawnee stopped walking. You didn't notice how they— Oh, I noticed, he said, turning to face her. But we're not here for them. She looked at him. Then who are we here for? He didn't answer that. Just took her hand again. Held it like truth. The next morning, Shawnee stood by the window of their room, watching the estate stir to life. Gardeners trimmed already perfect hedges. Staff carried silver trays into the dining room. Somewhere down the hall, Clarissa was probably getting her hair done for the brunch. Shaq sat on the edge of the bed, tying his shoes slowly. I don't know if I want to do this, Shawnee said quietly. He stood and crossed the room, putting his arms around her. We don't run from hard things, he said gently. We walk through them. She leaned into his chest, hearing the steady thud of his heart, like a drumbeat of calm. You always know what to say, she murmured. He kissed the top of her head. Not always. Just when it matters. There was a knock on the door. A young man in a crisp shirt handed them an updated seating chart. Shawnee scanned it. Her name was at the far edge of the reception layout. Nowhere near Clarissa. Nowhere near the family. Her hand trembled as she handed it to Shaq. He looked at it, then folded it once, and again, and set it aside. We'll handle it, he said. And for the first time since arriving, Shawnee believed they could. That evening, Shaq stood outside, under the arch of fairy lights strung across the garden. The sun had dipped low, painting the sky in honeyed gold. He watched Clarissa pose with Brad for engagement photos. Photographers snapping like bees. Brad's arm around her waist looked more like a grip than an embrace. Shawnee stood near the bar, quiet, shoulders drawn in, alone. Shaq took a slow breath and walked toward her, each step measured. You know what I've learned, he said as he reached her. She looked up. What? Sometimes the loudest room is the one that needs the quietest truth. Shawnee frowned. What truth? He glanced around. That love doesn't need permission, doesn't ask for approval. It just is. Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. She smiled, finally, something unbroken cracking through. Let's show them then, she said. He nodded. Let's. And as they turned back to the crowd, hands clasped, the Whitmores may have owned the venue, but Shaq and Shawnee owned the moment. Their presence was a protest. Their unity, a declaration. And though the stage had been set for exclusion, they were about to change the entire performance. The week leading up to the wedding moved like a slow, tightening noose. Shawnee sat at the kitchen counter of their Savannah rental, phone in hand, rereading Clarissa's latest text for the third time. It was short, too short, just a few clipped details about the schedule. No warmth, no emojis, no inside jokes. Shawnee sighed and set the phone down, staring out the window at the hazy afternoon sun. The butterflies she should have felt for her sister's big day weren't excitement. They were anxiety crawling under her skin. Shaq walked in quietly behind her, a giant silhouette in the doorway, wiping sweat from his forehead with a towel after his morning run. His easy smile faded when he saw her face. She's pulling away, isn't she? He said gently. Shawnee turned, startled. What? Clarissa, Shaq said, stepping closer. You keep waiting for the sister you know, but this wedding's pulling her somewhere else. Shawnee forced a small laugh. She's just busy. Weddings are stressful. Shaq raised an eyebrow, seeing through her deflection but respecting her space. He kissed the side of her head and went to shower, leaving Shawnee alone with the silence. Later that afternoon, a new message came through. This time from the wedding planner, not Clarissa. It was a finalized seating chart for the reception. Shawnee scrolled, searching for her name, frowning when she saw it near the bottom of the page. Table 12, all the way at the edge of the garden. Her chest tightened as she scanned the other names. Unfamiliar, no family, no friends, no one she knew. A polite exile. She clenched her jaw, fingers trembling slightly. There was no way Brad didn't have a hand in this. Clarissa would never. But then again, hadn't Clarissa been going along with everything lately? Shawnee bit her lip hard enough to sting, shoving the phone into her bag. She wouldn't tell Shaq, not yet. He had enough to think about. But Shaq wasn't blind. At the rehearsal that evening, he watched everything. The way Brad's smile never reached his eyes when they shook hands. The way Brad's mother's gaze flickered past Shawnee like she was barely there. He heard the too loud laughter at jokes that weren't funny. Sensed the stiffness in the air whenever they entered a room. At one point, standing by the refreshment table, Shaq overheard two groomsmen murmuring behind him. Did you see the size of him? Man, imagine that at your Thanksgiving table. Yeah, but can you blame Brad for wanting the pictures to stay, You know, classic? Shaq closed his eyes for a breath. He could feel the old burn rise in his chest, the one he'd spent a lifetime mastering. He smiled faintly, let it settle, and turned back to Shawnee, who was laughing too hard at something Clarissa's bridesmaid had said, her laugh just a little too sharp, a little too bright. That night, in the quiet of their room, Shawnee wrapped her arms around Shaq's waist, resting her head against his back. I don't know what's happening to her, she whispered. She's scared, Shaq murmured back. Scared to lose the people she's trying to impress. Shawnee's throat tightened. But why does she have to lose me to do that? Shaq turned, cupping her face gently. She hasn't lost you. You're still here. Shawnee nodded, but the ache in her chest didn't fade. The morning of the wedding arrived under a pale, glowing sky. Shawnee dressed carefully, smoothing the soft lavender fabric of her gown, adjusting her earrings, checking herself in the mirror 3, 4, 5 times. She felt her nerves twisting in her gut like a live wire. The driver arrived to take her to the estate, while Shaq handled a charity call that had come in last minute. She assured him she'd save him a seat, though inwardly she knew she'd probably be sitting alone for a while. At the venue, the staff guided her politely, too politely, through a side entrance, past bustling caterers and florists, until she reached the outer edge of the garden where table 12 waited. A small, lonely round table tucked near the back, just a few seats, none of which bore names she recognized. Shawnee sat down, feeling her stomach sink. She glanced across the sweeping lawn at the main family tables under the white canopy, where Clarissa's parents, Brad's relatives, and all the important guests were already settling in with cocktails and laughter. No one looked her way. She texted Shaq. Come soon. No reply yet. She stared at her phone, willing the seconds to pass faster. Back at the rental, Shaq closed his laptop, took a deep breath, and rolled his shoulders. He was running late, but he wasn't worried. He'd been late before to games, to meetings, but he was always right on time where it mattered. As he drove to the estate, Shaq reflected on the undercurrent of the weekend. The patterns he recognized too well. He'd walked into rooms like this before, rooms with money and prestige, and centuries-old walls built to keep certain people out. He knew the looks, the soft-edged dismissals, the undercurrent of stay in your lane. But Shaq was never about lanes. He was about presence. When he arrived at the estate, the staff scrambled a little, unsure where to guide him. One young woman gestured hesitantly toward the side, explaining something about his wife's table. Shaq raised a hand, thanked her calmly, and walked, not where they pointed, but directly across the garden, towering and sure, drawing eyes without arrogance. He saw her immediately. Shawnee, sitting alone, phone clutched in her lap, gaze flicking nervously across the crowd. As he approached, conversations paused. Heads turned. Cameras discreetly snapped. Brad, standing by the bar, froze mid-sentence. His jaw tightening. Shaq crossed the grass in long, slow strides, smiled wide, and knelt beside Shawnee's chair. Sorry, baby, he said softly, kissing her hand. You know I only care about where you are. Shawnee's face crumpled for just a second, eyes glistening, before she managed a shaky laugh. Brad's family watched, stiff and silent. Shaq stood, pulling up a chair, sitting at the edge of the table, without waiting for permission. He didn't need permission. His presence filled the space, commanding without aggression, unapologetic and kind. The unspoken rules, the seating charts, the polite barriers, the invisible walls, trembled just a little. Shaq smiled at the nearest server and asked politely for a drink, not as a celebrity, not as a power move, but as a man who knew who he was. And as the crowd watched, unsure how to respond, Shaq leaned in to Shawnee and murmured, "We're here, love. Let's show them how we stand." The groom's unspoken rules were beginning to crack, and the night hadn't even begun. The clatter of plates and the low hum of kitchen staff drifted through the swinging door just behind Shawnee's chair, a constant reminder of where she sat. Not among the glittering rows of family tables beneath the silk-draped canopy, but tucked away at a tiny round table shoved near the back, practically hugging the service entrance. Shawnee shifted in her seat, smoothing the soft lavender fabric of her dress, glancing around at the strangers beside her. They smiled politely, nodding in acknowledgement, but no one truly engaged. A distant cousin here, a college friend there, people who didn't know her, didn't try to know her. They were busy scanning the main lawn, watching the real action unfold, where the bride and groom mingled, laughed and posed for photos. Shawnee pressed her lips together, blinking back a sudden sting of tears. She shouldn't be surprised. She had seen the seating chart, felt the frost creeping in the days leading up to this moment. But knowing and feeling were two very different things. She clenched her hands in her lap, willing herself to hold steady. Shaq would be here soon. He'd stayed behind to handle an early morning charity event, one he simply couldn't skip, but he promised he'd make it in time. For now she sat alone, pretending not to notice the way Brad's mother kept glancing over with pursed lips, or how Brad himself seemed to avoid looking her way entirely. Clarissa, radiant in her flowing white gown, drifted among the guests, but even her eyes skimmed past Shawnee without landing. A hollow ache opened in Shawnee's chest. She tried to remind herself of all the reasons she had come. Loyalty, love, family. But the reasons felt thinner with every passing minute. She felt like a shadow here, a placeholder, a figure meant to stay politely tucked away. The music floated through the air, a gentle string quartet, delicate and formal. The laughter, the soft clinking of champagne glasses, the rustle of designer dresses. It all formed a cocoon of exclusivity. And Shawnee was acutely aware of the invisible line drawn around her. She wasn't part of the main picture. A server approached offering a tray of drinks, and Shawnee smiled politely, taking a glass of sparkling water. As the server turned to leave, Shawnee overheard a whispered comment from the next table. "I didn't think she'd come. You know her," a woman said, her voice dripping with thinly veiled disdain. "She's married to him, though." "What's his name?" "The basketball one," another murmured back, eyes darting toward the empty seat beside Shawnee. Shawnee's cheeks flushed hot. She felt exposed, as if every glance, every comment was stripping her bare. She took a shaky sip of water, eyes fixed firmly on the centerpiece in front of her. A delicate arrangement of pale roses and peonies that smelled faintly of powder. The minutes stretched on, slow and heavy. Somewhere across the garden, Clarissa threw her head back in laughter, her hand resting lightly on Brad's arm. Shawnee felt the weight of that image settle on her chest like a stone. She remembered late nights whispering in the dark with Clarissa when they were girls, dreaming about the future, promising they'd always have each other's backs. Now her sister barely acknowledged her. Shawnee's fingers tightened around the base of her glass. She checked her phone again. No new messages. She exhaled slowly, trying to let the tension slip away, but it clung stubbornly, knotting in her shoulders, her jaw. She could feel the weight of her isolation pressing down, the unspoken rejection curling at the edges of every interaction. She had walked into plenty of rooms where she didn't quite fit, but this was different. This was family, or it was supposed to be. Suddenly the conversation at the next table shifted, and Shawnee caught a fragment that sent a chill through her. "Surprised they're making room for everyone," someone said, the emphasis sharp, cutting. Shawnee's stomach twisted. She stared hard at the tablecloth, willing herself not to react, not to let the tears push through. Then, as if the universe knew exactly when to pull the strings, a hush rippled through the crowd. Heads turned, conversations faltered. A low murmur spread across the lawn, like the collective intake of breath before something monumental. Shawnee looked up, her heart leaping, and there he was, Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq, striding across the lawn in a crisp tailored suit, his presence filling the space effortlessly. His sheer size drew attention, but it was his aura, his calm, grounded warmth, that made people pause. He didn't rush, didn't bluster. He moved with quiet certainty, eyes scanning until they landed directly on her. Shawnee felt the tight knot in her chest loosen just slightly. Shaq approached, the crowd parting instinctively around him. He knelt beside her chair, one massive hand taking hers, his smile soft and real. "Sorry, baby," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her fingers. "I only care about where you are." Shawnee let out a shaky breath, a laugh catching in her throat. Shaq stood, pulling up a chair without waiting for permission, settling in beside her with a presence that instantly shifted the table's energy. The strangers beside her straightened in their seats, suddenly attentive, suddenly unsure how to act. Across the garden, Brad watched, his jaw tight, his hand clenched around his champagne glass. Shaq leaned in slightly toward Shawnee, his voice low and steady. "I see it," he said softly. "All of it." Shawnee's eyes glistened, but she held steady. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "I'm always coming for you," Shaq replied, his gaze steady, unshakable. The kitchen doors swung behind them, the clatter of plates a faint backdrop, but the noise no longer mattered. Shaq's presence wrapped around Shawnee like armor, like a shield she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Brad's family watched from across the lawn, their discomfort palpable. But Shaq didn't flinch, didn't rise to any bait, didn't force his way into the spotlight. He simply was, confident, loving, and immovable. The tension in the air sharpened, like a wire pulled tight. And though no one spoke it aloud, the unspoken message rippled through the crowd. The lines they had drawn, the barriers they had built, none of it could hold. Not here, not today. Shawnee sat a little taller, shoulders back, chin lifted. Together, they faced the room. The Groom's family might have set the stage, but Big Shaq had just changed the script, and the real show was only beginning. It happened in a ripple, not a crash. The sound of a heavy wooden door swinging open, the shuffle of sudden motion, the tightening of polite smiles stretched just a little too thin. Heads began to turn, one after another, like a soft chain reaction, as the presence at the entrance caught the room's attention. Shawnee felt it before she saw it. A shift in the air, a change in the temperature. Her eyes flicked up, past the towering white columns framing the reception hall, past the glittering chandeliers casting a golden glow over the tables, to the grand entrance where Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq, had just arrived. He stood tall, broad-shouldered and steady, dressed in a dark, sharp suit, tailored to his massive frame, his easy smile cutting through the tension like a quiet blade. He didn't stride in like a celebrity crashing a party. He moved with measured grace, his eyes sweeping across the space until they landed directly, only on Shawnee. For a heartbeat, the entire reception froze. Brad's family, who had spent months carefully curating every guest, every flower, every wine bottle to fit the image they wanted, stared in open discomfort. Brad himself, standing stiffly near the bar, narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening reflexively, as he whispered something sharp to his groomsman. Clarissa, radiant in her wedding gown, caught sight of Shaq and immediately flinched, glancing nervously at her new in-laws. But Shaq noticed none of them. Or rather, he chose not to. He crossed the room in long, unhurried strides, each step radiating quiet authority, drawing eyes without asking for them, commanding attention without arrogance. Whispers flared around him like sparks, guests murmuring behind their hands, a young cousin nudging her mother, two older guests squinting in surprise, as they realized exactly who had just walked in. Shawnee rose slightly from her chair, half standing, half unsure, her heart racing in her chest. But before she could take a full step, Shaq was there. He knelt beside her chair, towering even when lowered, his broad hand reaching gently for hers. He didn't glance at the crowd, didn't check for onlookers. His focus was singular, fierce in its softness. "I only care about where you are, baby," he said, his voice a rich, warm rumble that carried just enough to be heard. Shawnee's throat closed up. She let out a shaky, relieved laugh, blinking hard against the sudden sting in her eyes. She squeezed his hand, feeling the steady pulse beneath his skin, the unshakable presence that anchored her even as the room threatened to swallow her whole. All around them, the whispers intensified. Brad's parents, seated at the central family table, exchanged sharp, clipped looks. A hush spread through their section of the room, the discomfort thick enough to slice. This wasn't the tidy, polished picture they'd wanted for their wedding day, not the quiet, controlled elegance they had painstakingly assembled. This was something raw, something real, something they couldn't stage manage away. Shaq pulled up a chair, settling himself beside Shawnee, with effortless ease, his arm resting lightly on the back of her chair, as he leaned in, murmuring something that made her smile. The kitchen staff paused as they passed, unsure whether to avert their eyes or offer service. Across the room, Brad's friends watched with a mix of curiosity and thinly veiled judgment, their laughter faltering, their conversation growing stilted. Shawnee felt the shift like a weight lifting from her chest. For the first time that day, she could breathe without forcing herself to stay small, to stay polite. Shaq didn't demand the spotlight. He became it, simply by being. Clarissa finally approached, her steps hesitant, her fingers nervously twisting the delicate lace of her sleeve. "Shawnee," she began, her voice pitched just a little too high, "so glad you made it. And Shaq, wow, I didn't think I thought you had that charity thing." Shaq rose smoothly, towering over her, and smiled, warm, genuine, unbothered. "I wrapped it up early," he said calmly. "Wouldn't miss this for anything." Clarissa's eyes darted to Brad, standing rigid across the room, then back to her sister. "Well, I'm just glad you're here." she said quickly, though the words felt paper thin, her gaze flicking nervously over Shaq's shoulder, her smile stretched tight. Shawnee, steadying herself, reached out and briefly squeezed Clarissa's hand. "We're here, Rissa," she said softly. "We're here for you." Clarissa swallowed hard, nodded, and murmured a quick excuse to slip away, her expression cracking for just a second before she pasted on another smile and rejoined her new in-laws. Shaq watched her go, his brow furrowing just slightly, his mouth tightening at the edges. "She's in a storm she doesn't know how to face yet," he murmured under his breath. Shawnee leaned into his side, feeling the heat of him, the grounded certainty. "She's not the only one," she murmured back. Across the garden, Brad's parents called over the wedding planner in hushed tones, gesturing sharply toward Shaq's table, their expressions tight with disapproval. Brad himself took a long sip from his champagne glass, his knuckles white where they gripped the stem. The room was shifting, the energy tilting, the delicate balance they had worked so hard to maintain, wobbling under the weight of something they hadn't accounted for. Shaq didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to confront anyone. He simply was, and that alone was enough to shake the foundation of the carefully curated facade. They shared small smiles, whispered jokes, hands brushing under the table. Tiny rebellions of affection in a room that had tried so hard to push them to the margins. The whispers continued. The eyes continued to turn. But Shaq never wavered, never faltered. And the longer they stayed, the clearer it came. The groom's family had written a script, had planned a performance, but they had underestimated the power of someone who didn't need a stage, someone whose very being was a challenge to the quiet prejudices they had tried to hide behind polished smiles and polite exclusion. The dynamic was changing, slowly but surely, and the real confrontation had yet to come. Brad watched from the far end of the reception lawn, his champagne glass hanging slack in his fingers, his eyes narrowing with every passing minute. Across the garden, Shaq sat with one arm draped casually behind Shawnee's chair, his booming laughter carrying just enough to make the nearby guests lean in, half smiling, half watching. Shawnee, her face alight with relief and affection, tilted her head toward her husband, her tension eased in the circle of his presence. Brad could feel it, the shift, the tilt of attention, the way whispers had stopped focusing on the bridal couple, and instead flicked toward the towering figure now occupying the edge of the room yet dominating its energy. Brad's skin prickled with a heat he couldn't shake, his jaw tightening as he spotted his parents at the head table, their sharp, tight-lipped glances darting toward Shaq like silent accusations. Finally, Brad slammed his glass down on the tray of a passing server, muttering something curt, and crossed the lawn in long, brisk strides. His hand caught Clarissa's arm, just as she turned away from a small group of friends, startling her. "Brad," she gasped softly, laughing nervously. "What are you—" "We need to talk," Brad said under his breath, pulling her slightly aside, away from the glow of the lanterns strung across the garden. His fingers tightened on her wrist just a moment too long before he let go. Clarissa's smile faltered. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice lowering as she glanced around. "This isn't working," Brad hissed, running a hand through his carefully gelled hair. Look, I'm just gonna say it. Your sister's husband is overshadowing everything today." Clarissa blinked. "Shaq? He's just sitting quietly." "Are you kidding me, Clarissa?" Brad snapped, his voice pitched low, but sharp. "Look around. People are staring, whispering. The media people we invited are already noticing. This was supposed to be our day, and now it's turning into a circus." Clarissa's throat tightened as she followed his gaze, seeing Shaq casually chatting with a few cousins, his laugh easy, his attention fully on Shawnee. "I don't understand," she murmured. "He's not doing anything wrong." Brad let out a sharp breath, his jaw flexing. "It's the attention, Clarissa. It's the image. Look, I'm asking you. Can you talk to your sister? Ask her to maybe, I don't know, keep things a little more low profile tonight?" Clarissa's stomach twisted. Her eyes darted to her sister, the woman who had been her best friend, her fiercest defender, the one who had stood by her through every heartbreak and every triumph. Clarissa's chest tightened painfully. "You want me to ask her to shrink?" she said quietly. Brad's expression hardened. "I want you to remember whose family you were part of now." Clarissa felt her breath catch. She nodded faintly, unsure, her heart pounding as she slowly stepped away from him. Across the lawn, Shawnee looked up as Clarissa approached, her smile dimming slightly at the sight of her sister's pinched, nervous face. "Hey, Rissa," Shawnee said softly. "You okay?" Clarissa gave a shaky laugh. Yeah. I just, can we talk for a sec? Shaq, sensing the tension instantly, sat back slightly, his warm gaze moving between the sisters but letting them have space. Clarissa wrung her hands, her voice low, almost apologetic. Brad, is feeling a little overwhelmed. You know how families can be. He's just asking if maybe we can keep things a bit quieter tonight. Maybe, you know, not pull too much focus. Shawnee's smile froze. She blinked, heart thudding, her hands instinctively curling into fists in her lap. You want me to be smaller? She said slowly.
No. No, not like that, Clarissa rushed out, eyes wide. It's just, you know how he is? How his parents are. It's delicate.
Shawnee drew in a sharp breath, her throat tightening. She felt the familiar prickle of tears behind her eyes, the hurt blooming deep in her chest. Before she could find words, Shaq's deep, steady voice wrapped around her like a shield. Love, Shaq said gently, his eyes locked on hers, his hand resting warm and solid on her shoulder, doesn't shrink itself for anyone. The words hit like a soft thunderclap, reverberating through the tense silence between the sisters. Clarissa's eyes shimmered with sudden emotion, her mouth parting as if to speak, but no words came. Across the lawn, Brad watched with clenched fists, his parents whispering sharply to each other, their gazes snapping toward Shaq with barely concealed frustration. The air crackled, not with overt confrontation, not with shouted words or slammed fists, but with something subtler, sharper. The clash between quiet prejudice and unshakable dignity, between a carefully polished facade and an undeniable truth that refused to be boxed in or silenced. Shawnee sat straighter, lifting her chin as she reached for Shaq's hand, threading her fingers through his. Her heart pounded, but her resolve hardened. She wasn't here to disappear. She wasn't here to make herself small. Clarissa's breath hitched, her eyes flicking toward her sister's determined face, and something flickered deep inside her. Guilt, grief, the slow, painful recognition that she had let herself be pulled into a current she didn't fully understand. I'm sorry, Clarissa whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't mean. Shawnee gave her a small, sad smile. I know, Rissa. Clarissa nodded quickly, swallowing hard, before turning and hurrying back across the garden, wiping at her eyes as she went. Shaq let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around Shawnee's. You okay, baby? He murmured softly. Shawnee let out a shaky laugh, blinking rapidly. I think I am now. The night stretched on, the tension lingering like a storm cloud on the horizon. Brad and his family continued to steal sharp glances toward the edge of the reception, their whispers sharp, their smiles tight. But Shaq and Shawnee, side by side, remained a quiet, steady force, a reminder that no matter how carefully you curate a room, no matter how tightly you try to control the narrative, you can't erase love, you can't silence dignity, and you can't bend the truth to fit a smaller, neater box. And as the music played on, as the laughter bubbled artificially from polished lips, the real power in the room sat quietly at table 12, unshakable, unapologetic, and fully present. Behind the gilded doors of the Whitmore Estate's private lounge, the atmosphere was thick with agitation. Brad paced back and forth, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor as his parents sat stiffly on a velvet loveseat, their expressions pulled tight in controlled exasperation. His mother, Eleanor Whitmore, with her pearl necklace and immaculately coiffed hair, sipped delicately from a crystal glass of white wine, her lips pursed. His father, Charles, leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes hard and voice low. This is exactly what we were worried about, Brad, Charles said, cutting through the tension. This is your wedding. It was supposed to reflect your values, your family's standing, not be turned into a media spectacle because of a basketball player. Brad ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling just under the surface. I know, Dad. I know, but Clarissa insisted on inviting them. What was I supposed to do? Eleanor gave a brittle laugh. You should have put your foot down. Honestly, Brad, it's vulgar. He's completely showy, larger than life, drawing eyes. He doesn't know how to blend. Everyone's watching, Charles muttered, glancing toward the closed door as if expecting reporters to burst in. It's embarrassing. In the hallway outside, Harper Green, Clarissa's childhood friend, sharp-eyed and sharp-witted, paused, her steps faltering as she caught the muffled voices spilling through the crack in the door. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the unmistakable tone, the charged words, froze her in place. Harper had known Clarissa since they were teenagers, had been at sleepovers, and study nights, had laughed with her and shared secrets. But lately Clarissa had grown more distant, swept up in the Whitmore whirlwind, adjusting herself to fit into a mold Harper barely recognized, and now hearing the clipped disdain, the way Brad's parents spoke about Shaq, and by extension about Shawnee, Harper felt a slow, simmering anger twist in her gut. She stepped back quietly, slipping away before anyone noticed. Her heart pounded as she navigated the crowded reception space, scanning for Shawnee among the tables. Meanwhile, at the edge of the garden, Shawnee sat frozen, her heart pounding, her fingers knotted tightly in her lap. She had tried to push away the gnawing sense of rejection, tried to remind herself that this day was about Clarissa, not about her. But it was impossible to ignore the looks, the whispers, the invisible lines drawn around her. Shaq, ever steady, sat beside her, one arm resting along the back of her chair, his fingers occasionally brushing her shoulder as if to remind her, "I'm here, I see it all." And he did see it. The quick glances between Brad's parents, the way they leaned in to whisper sharply, the discomfort that rippled through the family whenever he so much as laughed or crossed the room. But Shaq didn't rise to it. He stayed calm, patient, grounded. He had been underestimated his whole life. That was nothing new. But tonight, he was paying attention. Harper found her moment, just as the band shifted to a softer song, the crowd thinning near the far edge of the garden. She slipped between tables, weaving past tipsy guests and distracted servers, until she reached table 12. "Shawnee," Harper said softly, touching her arm. Shawnee turned, surprised. She hadn't seen Harper in years, not since before Clarissa met Brad. "Hey Harper, right?" Shawnee said, forcing a smile.
Yeah.
Harper nodded quickly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. She leaned in, her voice low. "I need to tell you something." Shawnee's brow furrowed, a flicker of unease sparking in her chest. "What is it?" Harper hesitated, then pressed on. "The seating, the way they've been treating you tonight. It's not random. I overheard Brad's parents. They planned it. They didn't want you and Shaq near the family tables. They think you're a distraction." Shawnee's stomach dropped, a cold rush flooding through her limbs. Harper's face softened, her eyes full of apology. "I just thought you should know. I'm so sorry, Shawnee. This isn't fair." Shawnee sat back slowly, blinking hard as the weight of the truth settled on her shoulders. She had felt it, but hearing it confirmed, spoken aloud, was another kind of pain entirely. Shaq, who had been quietly watching, placed a hand on Shawnee's arm, his deep voice calm. "Thank you, Harper," he said smoothly, nodding once. Harper gave a faint, grateful smile. "If you need anything, I'm here." She squeezed Shawnee's hand before slipping away into the crowd, leaving the couple in a cocoon of quiet. Shawnee exhaled shakily, wiping at her eyes. "I can't believe this," she whispered. "I mean, I can, but hearing it," Shaq's thumb brushed gently along the back of her hand. "You knew," he said softly. "You felt it all along." "I guess I just hoped I was imagining it," Shawnee murmured, her voice cracking. Shaq gave a small, wry smile. "Baby, you've got instincts like steel. You don't imagine things, you sense them." Shawnee gave a shaky laugh, half tears, half breath. "What do we do now?" Shaq leaned back slightly, his gaze sweeping the crowd, his expression thoughtful. "We stay," he said simply. "We stay calm, we stay strong, and we let them show their hand. People always do eventually." Shawnee looked up at him, her heart tightening with love and gratitude. He made it sound so easy, but she knew the strength it took to sit in the middle of a room like this, and not break. As the music played on, as the laughter and clinking glasses surrounded them, Shaq and Shawnee remained steady at their table, watching, waiting, planning. Because some battles weren't fought with fists or raised voices. Some were fought with presence, and Shaq had mastered the art of making his presence known, without ever lifting a hand. The night was far from over, and the Whitmores had no idea what was coming. The clink of crystal, the rustle of chiffon, the low hum of conversation. The reception had slipped into its expected rhythm, a carefully orchestrated dance of small talk and curated smiles. But under the surface, the air vibrated with something unspoken. Shawnee felt it in the way Brad's parents kept darting glances her way, in the stiff smiles from the bridal party, in the hushed whispers as Shaq's deep laugh occasionally rumbled from table 12. But Shaq, as always, sat grounded, steady. He wasn't a man easily rattled. As the servers began placing the final dinner plates, and the band switched to softer background music. The wedding planner, a poised woman with a headset, approached the front with a mic in hand, ready to invite the next set of speeches. Clarissa's father had already spoken, as had Brad's father. The crowd was primed for the next familiar, expected voices. But then quietly, Shaq rose from his chair. He crossed the room without fanfare, the sheer size of him making space as he moved, people instinctively stepping aside. The wedding planner blinked up at him, startled. "Would you mind if I said a few words?" Shaq asked softly, his voice carrying with a warmth that disarmed her. I suppose," she stammered, handing over the mic, her eyes flicking nervously toward Brad and Clarissa. Across the room, Brad stiffened. His parents leaned in sharply, whispering furiously. Clarissa's face paled, her hand flying to her mouth. The guests shifted in their seats, some smiling curiously, others frowning, clearly wondering if this was about to turn into a celebrity spectacle. Shawnee watched from their table, her heart thudding, unsure what her husband was planning but trusting him, as always with her whole being. Shaq stepped to the front, holding the mic loosely in one massive hand, his other tucked casually in his pocket. He waited a moment, letting the murmurs settle, the crowd's energy tighten. Then, in a voice smooth and calm, he began. "I know what you're all thinking," he said with a soft chuckle. "Here comes the big guy, the basketball player, the headline name. What's he doing? Grabbing the mic at someone else's wedding?" Laughter rippled nervously across the room. Shaq smiled gently, nodding. "I get it. Trust me, I know how this looks, but I'm not here to steal anyone's spotlight. I'm here because, first and foremost, I'm family." His eyes softened as they flicked toward Clarissa. "I've watched Clarissa grow from the little sister who stole her big sister's clothes, to the woman you see today. Beautiful, strong, determined. And I've watched my wife, Shawnee, stand by her, love her, root for her every step of the way." Shawnee's breath hitched. Shaq turned slightly, his voice steady, measured. "Family, though, isn't just the people you share blood with. It's the people you choose. It's the people who stand with you, even when it's not easy, even when it's uncomfortable. It's the people who see you fully, your light, your flaws, your strength, and love you anyway." The room had gone still. Even the servers paused discreetly at the edges. Shaq's gaze swept the space, landing softly, intentionally, on the key faces in the crowd. And love, real love, doesn't shrink. It doesn't apologize for existing. It doesn't fit neatly into the boxes people might want it to. It grows. It challenges. It stretches us into better, fuller versions of ourselves. Clarissa's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in front of her. Brad sat stone-faced, his mouth a thin, hard line. His parents fidgeted, eyes sharp and calculating. Shaq smiled faintly, his voice gentle. "I wanted to stand here tonight, not as a player, not as a name, but as a brother, to say, Clarissa, I wish you joy. I wish you a love that grows, that expands, that doesn't ask you or anyone you love to make themselves smaller, just to fit in." The crowd sat frozen. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. A few dabbed at their eyes. Shaq's eyes softened. "Because here's the truth. Life's too short for smallness of spirit. It's too short for walls we build inside ourselves, or around each other, out of fear or pride or prejudice." Shawnee felt her heart swell, a knot loosening inside her that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Shaq let out a soft breath, smiling warmly now. "So let's raise a glass," he said, lifting his own champagne flute from the table beside him. "To Clarissa and Brad, may you walk into a future filled with honesty, with courage, and with a love that makes room for every part of who you are." The guests, stirred by the unexpected weight of his words, slowly lifted their glasses. Some faces glowed with admiration, others tightened in discomfort, realizing the undercurrent they could no longer ignore. Clarissa's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Brad's face remained rigid, his fingers clenched around his glass. Shaq smiled gently, clinking his glass against Shawnee's as he returned to her side. He didn't look for applause. He didn't need it. He sat down quietly, his arm brushing against Shawnee's, his presence solid and unwavering. Shawnee turned to him, her eyes glistening. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. Shaq chuckled softly. "Yeah, I did." Across the room, Brad's parents exchanged tense whispers, their polished facades cracking just slightly, as they realized the room's attention had shifted in a way they hadn't planned, hadn't wanted, couldn't control. Because sometimes power didn't come from pushing people out or keeping them small. Sometimes power came from showing up fully and refusing to shrink. And in that moment, the entire room knew. The real weight in the room wasn't in titles or family crests or carefully arranged seating charts. It was in the quiet, steady force of a man who knew who he was, who loved without apology, and who had just reminded everyone present exactly what love was supposed to look like. Brad downed his third glass of bourbon faster than the others, feeling the slow burn in his throat, the flush creeping up his neck. The reception hall buzzed around him, a blur of laughter, clinking glasses, and the occasional burst of camera flashes. But Brad's ears had tuned all of it out, focused sharply on one thing, the hum of whispers following Shaquille O'Neal's toast. Brad clenched his jaw, watching Shaq return to his seat with effortless calm, watching the way people leaned in, smiling, nodding, drawn to his presence. That towering frame, that deep voice, that unshakable poise, all of it sucking the oxygen out of his day, his wedding, his moment. He felt a hand brush his arm. Clarissa. Her eyes shimmered, her cheeks still pink from emotion. "Wasn't that beautiful?" she murmured, glancing toward Shaq and Shawnee with a soft, wistful smile. Brad forced a thin, brittle laugh. "Yeah, beautiful," he echoed, though the word tasted like acid. He downed the rest of his drink in one sharp motion. Clarissa hesitated, her smile faltering as she watched him. "Brad, are you okay?" "Fine," he muttered, stepping away before she could press further. At table 12, Shawnee exhaled softly, pressing her fingers briefly to her temple. Shaq rubbed her back gently, his palm warm and steady. "You were amazing," she whispered. Shaq smiled faintly. "I just spoke truth." Shawnee's chest tightened with a mix of pride and ache. She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining under the table. Across the room, Harper sat frozen at her table, watching Brad weave between guests, a tight, tense energy coiling around him. She felt the weight of everything she'd overheard earlier, the sharp disdain behind closed doors, the calculated exclusion, the resentment, and now watching Brad's face, Harper saw the unraveling beginning. It happened faster than anyone expected. Brad approached their table, his steps just a little too quick, his smile stretched just a little too wide. He clinked his glass sharply, drawing a few startled glances. "Well," Brad said loudly, his voice carrying across the nearest tables, "I guess we should all thank Shaquille O'Neal for the most memorable moment of our wedding." Shawnee stiffened, her spine snapping straight. Shaq's eyes narrowed slightly, his shoulders settling into a quiet, racing calm. Clarissa, catching up breathlessly, reached for Brad's arm. "Brad, maybe," but Brad shrugged her off, his gaze fixed on Shawnee now.
I mean, honestly, Shawnee, you've been, sitting back there making this all about you two? About your story, your moment? This was supposed to be about us today.
The words dropped like stones into the center of the room. Conversations stilled. Glasses paused midair. Heads turned sharply. Shawnee felt the heat rush to her face, her heart hammering in her chest. She opened her mouth, a protest dying on her tongue. Shaq, slow and measured, rose to his full height, his massive frame commanding without aggression.
Brad.
Shaq said calmly, his voice smooth, unshaken. "I was here to celebrate you. Don't mistake love for competition." Brad let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Yeah, well, not everything's about love, is it? Sometimes it's about knowing when to let other people have their moment." Clarissa's face crumpled in slow-motion humiliation, her hands flying to her mouth, as she let out a soft, strangled "Brad, stop." But Brad, flushed and fuming, didn't hear her. Then, unexpectedly, Harper rose from her seat, her voice, usually sharp with wit, cut through the tension like a blade. "Actually, Brad," she said coolly, her eyes flashing, "I think the problem isn't the attention Shaq's getting. I think the problem is the attention you aren't getting. And maybe, just maybe, the fact that your family spent the last 2 weeks deliberately sidelining Shawnee and Shaq because you didn't want them too close to the center of your precious little spotlight." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clarissa staggered slightly, tears welling, her head shaking in denial. But Harper's gaze stayed locked on Brad. "Yeah," Harper went on, her voice low but firm. "I heard them, behind the doors, talking about how to keep the guest list clean, how to manage the image, how to contain Shaq. So maybe, Brad, you need to sit down before you embarrass yourself more than you already have." The silence was crushing, the crowd frozen, eyes wide, breaths held. Brad's mouth opened, closed, his face turning an ugly shade of red. For one wild second, Shawnee thought he might lunge forward, might shout something, might do something irrevocable. But then, without warning, Brad spun on his heel, storming off toward the bar, shoving past stunned guests, as Clarissa crumpled onto a nearby chair, her head buried in her hands. The band, confused, faltered into an awkward off-key chord before stopping altogether. Shawnee sat frozen, her hands trembling, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Shaq reached for her, his arms wrapping around her shoulders, his voice murmuring steady, grounding words in her ear. "Breathe, baby," he whispered. "Just breathe. I've got you." Shawnee leaned into him, her face pressing against his chest, feeling the deep, steady thrum of his heartbeat under her cheek. All around them, the guests stirred, a low wave of whispers, of shifting chairs and uneasy glances. A carefully constructed illusion of the perfect wedding had shattered, the cracks laid bare for all to see. But Shaq, rock solid, remained. He didn't chase the drama, didn't raise his voice, didn't retaliate. He held Shawnee close, his hand running gently up and down her back, his presence a fortress in the storm. Because he knew some fights weren't worth stepping into. Some storms were best weathered by standing tall, steady, unshaken. And as the room slowly, awkwardly tried to reset itself, the music creeping back in, the servers awkwardly circulating, Shaq and Shawnee sat together at their table, their heads close, their hands entwined. Let them whisper. Let them squirm. They knew the truth. And no collapse, public or private, could shake the foundation they had built. Clarissa slipped out the side door of the reception hall, her chest heaving, her white gown trailing behind her like a ghost. The night air hit her like a slap, cool, sharp, cutting through the haze of shame and panic clouding her mind. She stumbled down the stone steps into the side garden, her trembling hands clutching at the delicate fabric bunched around her waist. Somewhere inside, the music had hesitantly resumed, the guests nervously pretending they hadn't just witnessed the implosion of the night. But Clarissa could still feel every eye, every whisper, every jagged edge of the disaster she'd helped create. She found herself near a bench tucked beneath a flowering archway, half hidden from view. She sank down, gasping, shaking. A sob slipped out before she could stop it, followed by another, until her shoulders were racked with silent, body-racking tears. She barely registered the quiet footsteps approaching. Clarissa, came the soft, familiar voice. She looked up sharply to see Shawnee standing just a few feet away, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. Behind her, Shaq hovered a respectful distance back, his massive frame shadowed, his gaze watchful but calm. Clarissa choked on a half-sob, wiping furiously at her cheeks. I didn't know where. Shawnee stepped closer, kneeling in front of her sister, gently taking Clarissa's trembling hands in hers. "It's okay," Shawnee murmured. "You're okay. Just breathe." Clarissa let out a jagged breath, her chest shuddering. "No, I'm not okay. None of this is okay. God, Shawnee, what did I do?" Shawnee's voice remained soft, but there was a new steel beneath it. "Talk to me, Rissa." Clarissa squeezed her eyes shut, more tears slipping free. "I knew," she whispered brokenly. "I knew. I saw the way Brad's parents talked about you, the way they tried to push you aside, the way they whispered about Shaq. I knew. I thought if I ignored it, if I kept smiling, it would go away. I was so scared to rock the boat, Shawnee. I was so scared they'd hate me too." Shawnee's throat tightened, her own tears welling. "Oh, Rissa." Clarissa let out a ragged sob. "I wanted them to love me so badly. I wanted to fit. I kept telling myself they'd change. They'd soften, that maybe I was imagining it all. But I wasn't. And now Brad. God, the way he spoke to you, the way he treated you. She buried her face in her hands, shaking. Shawnee reached forward, wrapping her arms around her sister, pulling her close. The two of them clung together, rocking slightly, the weight of years, of hopes, of broken dreams, pressing down on them. Shaq watched quietly from a few steps away, his heart heavy, but his expression composed. He knew this wasn't his moment to step in, to fix, to carry. This was between sisters, between two women who had weathered storms together and were now standing at the edge of something raw and real. After a long, quiet moment, Clarissa pulled back slightly, wiping at her soaked cheeks. "What do I do, Shawnee?" she whispered. "What am I supposed to do? Do I go back in there, pretend this can still work? Do I marry a man who let all of this happen, Who let me become part of the problem? How do I even face him right now? Shawnee's chest ached. She looked over her sister's crumpled face, saw the little girl she used to hold after nightmares, saw the young woman she used to cheer for, saw the broken bride sitting before her now. You already know what you have to do, Shawnee said softly. Clarissa let out a shaky breath, her hands twisting in her lap. I'm scared, she admitted in a small voice. I'm scared of what happens if I walk away. What people will say, how it will look, what it means. Shawnee reached forward, tucking a strand of hair behind her sister's ear. You don't have to be perfect, Risa. You just have to be honest. Clarissa's lower lip trembled. Her gaze flicked toward Shaq, who met her eyes calmly, offering a faint reassuring nod. His presence was like a quiet, unshakable wall, not judging, not pressuring, simply holding space. Shaq, Clarissa whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry. For everything. For not standing up. For letting them treat you like that. For… She broke off, tears spilling over again. Shaq stepped forward slowly, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. His voice was deep, gentle. Clarissa, you've got your own road to walk. Don't carry guilt for their actions. Just decide who you want to be now. Clarissa let out a breath, her shoulders sagging under the weight of his words. Inside, the music drifted faintly. The sounds of forced laughter, of clinking glasses, of a party trying to stitch itself back together. But here, in this small garden pocket, time had stopped. Clarissa reached for her sister's hands again, gripping them tightly. I don't think I can go back in there, she whispered. Not like this. Shawnee squeezed her hands gently. Then don't. The words hung in the air, heavy, final. A fork in the road. Clarissa's breath shuddered. Slowly, she nodded, the decision beginning to settle in her bones. Trembling but certain. Shaq rose, offering his hand to Clarissa. She took it hesitantly, letting him pull her to her feet. For a moment, the three of them stood there. The towering, steady figure of Shaq, the tear-streaked but determined Shawnee, and the trembling, awakening Clarissa, facing the hardest truth of her life. The suspense pressed in, the unanswered questions looming. What would happen next? What would the fallout be? But in this moment, there was only one certainty. Clarissa was done pretending, and no matter how much it broke her heart, she knew she had to choose herself now, fully, honestly, and without apology. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and Clarissa stepped inside, her breath steady despite the chaos of her heart. Her gown trailed behind her like a fading dream, and her bare fingers trembled slightly as she clutched the edge of the silk skirt. The reception had hit that strange, uneasy lull, the part of the night where small groups huddled, conversations thinned, and the air felt stretched thin by all the things left unsaid. Shawnee walked just behind her, her hand resting lightly on her sister's back, the silent support that had been there since childhood. And Shaq, towering, unshakable, followed, his steady steps like an anchor trailing them both. Clarissa stopped just before the main floor, where Brad stood near the bar, laughing a little too loudly at something a groomsman said, his drink half drained, his smile brittle and forced. His parents perched at the family table, their expressions pulled taut, their eyes sweeping the room like royalty scanning for dissenters. Clarissa drew in a deep breath, her chest rising and falling. Her heart pounded in her ears, and for one suspended second, she imagined simply slipping out the side door, disappearing into the night, letting the whole thing collapse quietly behind her. But then Shawnee's voice, soft but sure, floated to her ear. You've got this, Rissa. Clarissa turned slightly, locking eyes with her sister, seeing the tears there, the fierce love, the shared ache of everything they'd been through. And just behind her, Shaq gave a slow, encouraging nod, his massive presence radiating quiet strength. Clarissa swallowed hard, squared her shoulders, and moved forward. She stepped onto the small platform near the head table, where the wedding planner's mic still sat. She picked it up with trembling hands, the soft feedback making half the room flinch in turn. Everyone, Clarissa said, her voice shaking at first, then finding a steady rhythm. I know this isn't part of the schedule, but I need to say something. A hush fell across the room. Brad's laugh cut off sharply, his head whipping toward her, his brow furrowed in confusion. His parents sat frozen, their mouths tight. Clarissa took another breath, blinking back the sting of tears. I want to thank you all for coming, she began, her voice clear. I know many of you traveled far, that you've been here to celebrate Brad and me, and I wanted this day to be perfect. I really did. Her gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Harper, who sat forward slightly, her eyes wide and watchful.
But Clarissa continued, her voice wobbling but strong.
Sometimes a day isn't about the perfect flowers or the perfect pictures or the perfect seating charts. Sometimes it's about truth. A ripple moved through the crowd. Small shifts, quiet murmurs, nervous glances. Clarissa's fingers tightened on the mic. The truth is, she said, her voice breaking slightly, I can't stand here and pretend that everything is okay. I can't pretend I didn't see the way Brad's family treated people I love. I can't pretend I didn't ignore things I should have faced. And I won't start a marriage built on silence and smallness. Brad shot to his feet, his face pale, his mouth opening in a sharp, strangled, Clarissa, what the hell are you? Clarissa raised a hand, her eyes glistening. No, Brad. Please. Brad froze, his fists clenched at his sides. Clarissa turned back to the crowd. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm sorry to every guest here who was made to feel less than. I'm sorry to my sister, to Shawnee, who deserved so much better. I'm sorry to myself for letting it get this far. A stunned silence blanketed the room. I can't marry you, Brad, Clarissa said softly, turning back to him. Not like this. Not knowing what I know now. Not knowing what we've both allowed. Brad's face crumpled, his mouth working soundlessly, his chest heaving with a stunned, angry breath. Clarissa set the mic gently down, her hands trembling, her shoulders sagging with the weight of the words she had finally released. For a heartbeat, the room stayed frozen. And then, the murmurs began. Sharp, darting whispers, shocked glances, the rustle of disbelief rippling through silk dresses and tailored suits. Shawnee moved quickly, reaching her sister's side, wrapping her arms around her, pulling her into a fierce, tearful embrace. I'm so proud of you, Shawnee whispered against Clarissa's hair. So proud of you. Clarissa sobbed into her sister's shoulder, her whole body shaking with the release. Shaq stepped forward quietly, his massive hand resting gently on Clarissa's back, his presence calm, grounding, a steady force as the chaos of the room swirled around them. It's never too late to choose yourself, Shaq murmured softly, his deep voice wrapping around the sisters like a shield. Clarissa pulled back, her eyes swollen and red, her breath hitching in her chest. She looked up at Shaq, her voice breaking on a tearful laugh. Thank you, she whispered. Shaq gave a small, warm smile. You did the hard part, Clarissa. You stood up. Together the three of them turned, slipping quietly from the head table, from the stunned crowd, from the wreckage of a night that was supposed to celebrate one kind of love, but ended up revealing another. They moved through the doors and into the cool night air, the sky above them wide and endless, the stars faint but steady. Shawnee laced her fingers through Shaq's, her other arm wrapped tightly around Clarissa's shaking shoulders. They walked down the stone steps, their figures silhouetted against the glow of the reception hall, the faint music still playing inside. Behind them, the murmurs would grow, the gossip would spread, the fallout would come. But for now, they had each other. No fist thrown, no scenes made, just the quiet, unshakable power of truth, spoken aloud, of love that didn't shrink, of dignity that refused to bend. At the foot of the stairs, Clarissa faltered slightly, her knees wobbling. Shaq reached out instinctively, steadying her, helping her to her feet. Easy, he rumbled softly. You've got this. Clarissa let out a shaky breath, wiping at her eyes, a faint watery smile breaking through. And as they walked into the night, arm in arm, they carried with them the kind of strength that couldn't be staged, couldn't be polished, couldn't be faked. Because sometimes, the wedding that never was revealed, the love that always would be. If this story stirred something in you, the fire, the ache, the triumph, don't let it fade when the screen goes dark. Carry its questions into your own life. Where do you stand when quiet injustice slips into the room? Remember, the most powerful moments often come without a headline or spotlight. Stay with us for more stories that push beneath the surface and demand you feel every beat. Because the best stories don't end. They live on inside the choices we make next.